It all started when Emily moved into the old house at the end of the street. She was excited to begin a new life, away from the busy city. The house was large, with tall trees surrounding it and a long, winding path leading up to the front door. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. As Emily unpacked her things and began settling in, she noticed something strange. In the basement, there was a door. It was old, wooden, and covered in dust. The door was different from the others in the house. For one, it had several locks on it, and someone had painted over it in dark colors, almost as if they were trying to hide it. She found it odd but didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was just a door. Maybe it led to an old storage room or a cellar, something unimportant. She ignored it for a while. But every time she went down to the basement to do laundry, she felt a chill run down her spine when she passed by that door. There was something unsettling about it, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. One day, Emily was curious enough to ask her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, about it. Mrs. Thompson was an old woman who had lived on the street for as long as anyone could remember. She knew everything about the neighborhood. When Emily mentioned the door in the basement, Mrs. Thompson's face turned pale. "You must never open that door," she said in a low voice, almost a whisper. "Especially not after midnight." Emily laughed, thinking it was some kind of local legend or superstition. But the way Mrs. Thompson looked at her with serious eyes made her uneasy. "Why?" Emily asked, but Mrs. Thompson just shook her head. "Some things are better left closed," she muttered before turning to walk away. That night, Emily couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Thompson had said. Why couldn't she open the door? What was behind it? Was there something dangerous down there? The more she thought about it, the more her curiosity grew. She decided she would take a closer look at the door tomorrow. After all, what was the harm in just looking? The next day, Emily went down to the basement with a flashlight. She examined the door carefully. The locks were old and rusty, but it didn't seem like anyone had tried to open them in years. There were no strange noises coming from behind the door, no signs of anything unusual. Yet she still felt uneasy. As she stood there, staring at the door, she noticed something on the floor, a small, folded piece of paper. It was tucked just under the edge of the door, as if it had slipped out from the other side. Emily picked it up and unfolded it. The paper was old and yellowed, but the words were clear. "Never after midnight." Emily felt a chill go through her. The note was simple but eerie. Who had written it, and why? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with the door, but at the same time, she couldn't stop herself from wanting to know more. That night, she lay in bed, tossing and turning. Her mind kept going back to the basement door. What was behind it? Why were there so many locks? What could be so dangerous that it had to stay locked up? Just before she drifted off to sleep, she made a decision. She was going to open the door. Maybe not tonight, but soon. She had to know what was behind it. Days passed, but the thought of the basement door haunted Emily's mind. Every night, as she lay in bed, she found herself listening to the silence of the house, wondering if there was someone on the other side of that door. The warning from Mrs. Thompson echoed in her head. Never after midnight. What could happen after midnight? Why was that time so important? It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but this was real life. One evening, Emily decided to prepare herself. She bought a set of tools to unlock the door and kept them ready in the basement. She didn't know when she would get the courage to use them, but she knew that moment was coming. The nights felt longer and the house seemed colder. Emily started noticing small things, footsteps creaking in the hallways, shadows moving in the corners of her vision. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left her. Then one night it happened. Emily woke up suddenly, her heart racing. She glanced at the clock. It was 11:45 p.m. The house was eerily quiet, but she felt an urge to get up. Without thinking, she grabbed her flashlight and made her way to the basement. Standing in front of the door, Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The note was still in her pocket, and its warning echoed in her mind. Never after midnight. But it wasn't midnight yet. She knelt down and began working on the locks. One by one, the old, rusty locks clicked open. It was almost too easy. By the time she reached the last lock, she realized it was 11:59 p.m. Emily hesitated, her hand resting on the final lock. What if there's something dangerous behind this door? But her curiosity won out. She turned the last lock and slowly opened the door, just as the clock struck midnight. And then the house seemed to breathe. Emily stood frozen as the door creaked open. The sound was louder than she expected, almost like a groan echoing through the dark, empty basement. For a moment, she was too scared to move. Her flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced on the cold concrete walls. Slowly, she pushed the door wider and shone her flashlight into the room beyond. At first, all she saw was darkness. The beam of light barely penetrated the gloom. But as she stepped forward, something strange caught her eye. The room was much larger than she had imagined, far too large to fit within the confines of her house. The air felt colder here, heavy and damp, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Emily's skin prickled with goosebumps, and her breath fogged in front of her face. She took a cautious step forward, her heart racing, the flashlight shaking slightly in her hand. As the light moved across the floor, she saw something odd, old furniture, covered in sheets, like someone had left in a hurry. There were broken picture frames leaning against the wall, a dusty old table, and a chair tipped over on its side. It looked like a room frozen in time, untouched for years. But that wasn't what unnerved Emily the most. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that she wasn't alone. She could hear it now, a faint sound coming from deeper inside the room. It was subtle, like whispering voices, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. It almost sounded like they were calling her name, but that couldn't be right. Could it? She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But as she took another step forward, the whispering grew louder. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening thud. Emily spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. She rushed back to the door and grabbed the handle, pulling with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had sealed itself shut. Panic set in as she pounded on the door, her flashlight flickering. "Let me out!" she shouted, her voice trembling. But no one answered. The house above was silent, and the whispers from the dark room grew louder. Then she heard it, a soft creak, like someone stepping on the floorboards behind her. Emily whipped around, shining her flashlight toward the sound. Her heart raced, and her breathing was shallow as she pointed the beam of light into the far corner of the room. And that's when she saw it. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure. At first, it was barely visible, a shadowy shape that seemed to blend into the darkness. Emily's hand trembled, and her flashlight flickered again, threatening to go out. She took a step back, her legs shaking. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching her every move. It wasn't human, that much she knew. It was too tall, its limbs too long, its presence too unnatural. She wanted to scream, but her voice was stuck in her throat. All she could do was stare at the figure, her mind racing with fear and confusion. What was it? And why was it here, behind the locked door? The whispers grew louder, more insistent. But now they didn't sound like voices. They sounded like wind, rushing through the room, circling around her. Emily felt her skin crawl as the figure in the corner shifted slightly, its head tilting as if it was studying her. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, she heard it. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The words sent a chill through her bones. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, and she took another step back, her body trembling. "What? What do you want?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond, but it moved again, just a small movement, like a predator watching its prey. Emily's mind raced. She had to get out. She had to escape this room. But the door was locked, and there was no other way out. Desperation took over. She turned and ran toward the door, banging on it with all her might. "Help! Someone help!" she screamed, but the house above was silent. Then behind her, she heard the floor creak again. The figure was moving. Slowly. It began to step out of the shadows, its long, twisted limbs making soft thudding noises as it walked across the floor. Emily turned around, her back pressed against the door, her flashlight pointed at the figure. She watched in horror as it came closer. Its face, or what she assumed was its face, was covered in darkness, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold and unblinking. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it repeated, the voice now louder, more menacing. Emily's heart raced as the figure took another step closer. She could see it clearly now, a tall, shadowy creature with long, thin arms and legs, its body distorted as if it didn't belong in this world. "Why? Why are you here?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, watching her, waiting. And then, with a voice that sent shivers down her spine, it spoke again. "Because you let me in." Emily's mind was spinning. The creature's words echoed in her head. "Because you let me in." What did that mean? Had she somehow released this thing by opening the door? What was it? And how long had it been trapped here? The figure moved closer, its presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. Emily felt like she couldn't breathe, like the very air was being sucked out of her lungs. She knew she had to act fast, but she didn't know how to escape. The door was locked, and there was no other way out. Suddenly, the figure stopped. It stood just a few feet away from her, its shadowy form looming over her like a nightmare come to life. Emily braced herself, expecting it to strike, but instead, it whispered once more. The door was never meant to be opened. Her mind raced. Was there some way to lock the creature back in? Could she reverse what she had done? She didn't know, but she had to try. Without thinking, she darted past the figure, her body moving on instinct. She grabbed the locks she had opened earlier, trying to slam them back into place. But the figure was faster. It moved with unnatural speed, appearing right beside her in an instant. "It's too late," it hissed. Emily's heart pounded as she struggled with the locks, her hands trembling. Too late. What did that mean? Had she unleashed something that couldn't be stopped? Emily's hands fumbled with the locks, her mind racing. The creature's words, "It's too late," echoed in her head, but she refused to believe it. She couldn't let this thing win. Desperation fueled her as she wrestled with the door, trying to shut it once more. If only she could lock it again, maybe, just maybe, it would trap the creature back inside, where it belonged. But the creature was relentless. It moved closer, its shadow engulfing her. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. Emily could feel its icy breath on her neck, and her hand shook so badly she could barely hold the lock. Then, with a sudden force, the door slammed shut, trapping Emily inside with the creature. The darkness in the room became suffocating, the whispers turning into guttural growls. Emily pressed herself against the door, her heart pounding, her breath shallow. "You can't leave," the creature said softly, its voice almost mocking. "You belong here now." Emily's stomach twisted in terror. She had come down here thinking she could explore the basement, thinking it was just another mystery of the house. But she had been wrong. This wasn't just any room. It was a prison that held something far worse than she had ever imagined. Suddenly, the creature's hand reached out, its long, twisted fingers brushing against her arm. Emily screamed, backing away as far as she could. The creature moved slowly, deliberately, almost as if it enjoyed her fear. She felt the walls closing in on her, the cold seeping into her bones. There was nowhere to go. The door wouldn't open, and the creature was getting closer. Emily's mind raced. She had to think of something, anything, to get out of here. "Why?" she gasped, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" The creature paused, its head tilting slightly as if considering her question. For a moment, there was silence, and then it spoke. "Because you opened the door." Emily's heart sank. She had brought this on herself. The warnings, the strange occurrences, the sense of dread, all of it had been leading to this moment. She had ignored the signs, and now she was paying the price. But as the creature moved closer, something inside Emily snapped. She wasn't going to give up. Not like this. She had come too far, and she wasn't about to let some shadowy figure from the basement take her life. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily grabbed the nearest object, a broken piece of wood from the floor, and swung it at the creature. It passed through the creature's body as if it were made of smoke, but for a brief second the figure flickered, its form wavering. That was it. She had to fight back. Emily swung again, and the creature faltered, its shape rippling in the darkness. She wasn't sure if she could defeat it, but she had to try. With every swing, she felt the creature's presence weaken, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. But the whispers, they wouldn't stop. "You can't win," the creature hissed, its voice filled with malice. Emily's breaths came in ragged gasps as she fought, but she was growing tired. The room felt like it was spinning, the shadows swirling around her. She could barely see, barely think. And then, just as she felt she couldn't go on any longer, she heard a voice, soft, faint, but unmistakable. "Emily, wake up." Her eyes snapped open. She was lying on her bed, the familiar comfort of her bedroom around her. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains, and the eerie darkness of the basement was gone. Her heart was still racing, her body covered in cold sweat, but she was safe. It had been a dream. Emily sat up, her breath shaky, her mind still reeling from the nightmare. She glanced around the room, half expecting to see the shadowy figure lurking in the corner, but there was nothing, just the quiet of the early morning and the faint sound of birds chirping outside. But as she looked toward her bedroom door, her blood ran cold. There, etched into the wood, were deep, claw-like marks, exactly where the creature had touched her in the dream. The basement door was never spoken of again. Emily never ventured down there, not even during the day. She tried to put the nightmare behind her, convincing herself it was all in her head. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still waiting behind that door, lurking in the shadows. And late at night, when the house was quiet, she could still hear it, the faint sound of whispers coming from deep within the basement. Whispers that reminded her of one thing: you shouldn't have opened the door.